Yeah, done with my Oreo.
Okay, good.
Do we really know what happened?
The brother did.
The brother, that's what I thought too.
I mean, that seems like kind of obvious.
Hey, do you want to talk about death?
Yeah. I mean,
Murdery thingy.
At the same time.
Sorry. Okay.
Okay. Welcome to Mystery Murdery Thingy. Ooh, yeah.
Yay! I'm Mario.
I'm Chloe.
What's up?
Did you get that?
Did you get my burp?
Did you get
Did
that
hear it?
on
Did you
the
hear my
mic?
burp?
On the mic?
This is the time, and this is the record of the time. Just a little Laurie Anderson for you guys.
I was going to say, what's that from?
It's a Laurie Anderson song.
She's weird.
She's really good.
I remember you were like, yeah, like, we can listen to her, but I don't think you'll like her.
Yeah. Sometimes you just know. But,
Happy Wednesday, my friends.
Happy Wednesday. We are here doing the pod.
It's
on time.
on time. It is Wickety Wednesday. I don't know where that came from. I'm sorry. I'd like to take that back.
1993.
Wicked now word.
Hey, I don't know if you guys have heard the hip jive, but it's Wednesday.
Oh my God.
Okay, I'm gonna go first. Okay, I'm gonna
Yay.
talk about a man of mystery. Moe Berg, the man of mystery. That's my topic for this week.
I'm excited. I love when people themselves are like an enigma, like a mystery.
Yes, that's a good way to describe Moe, actually, as an enigma. I like that. So Moe Berg. Who was Moe Berg? He was a big league catcher for most of his career. He was a spy. For many years, he was honestly kind of a bum. We'll get into it. We'll talk about it. But, you know, he was mysterious right from he came out mysterious, right? If I can say that. For example, even his name and his date of birth are somewhat obscure. In a lot of the baseball histories and in some of the sources that I read, his date of birth is listed as March 2nd, 1902, and his name as Morris, Moe being, of course, a nickname. But his birth certificate actually says that he was born on May 3rd, 1902, and was named Moses Berg.
If we have his birth certificate, why is it in question?
That's a mystery. Like, why is it even listed differently in all these? Yeah, that itself is a mystery. No one knows. So, Berg was also a great mystery to his baseball teammates. For example, they never knew where he went after baseball games because he would just peace.
What?
And he was actually dubbed, I believe, by Ted Williams as the Mystery Man. And Carl Stengel, who was a manager of Berg's, called him the strangest man ever to play baseball. And he had some sort of... He was quirky. Moe was a quirky guy. For example, if he saw you on the street, and you were like one of his teammates, or for a lot of his life, just like anyone that he knew, he would just completely ignore you and just keep walking.
What?
Or like put his, kind of like finger up to his lips, like shh, and then just like keep walking. Because he was a man of mystery.
No, that's
and
just creepy.
You just didn't understand what he was really doing. So his teammates and management were pretty perplexed by Moe. They were also kind of, unsure as to why he was even playing baseball in the first place when he first started, because he actually took time off of his first few seasons to finish law school. Now, of course, they didn't know all about his family history, how his dad hated baseball, never wanted him to play. His dad never saw him play a game of baseball, and he played for almost 30 continuous years from school to the end of his professional career. Which is pretty sad, honestly. But this also kind of explains, why he was, so adamant about, showing up late to a few seasons, even though it, may have cost him professionally in order to actually become a lawyer. Because he may have made some, deal with his dad. There was, one summer where he kind of had a, come to Jesus moment. Of course, Moe Berg was a non-practicing Jew, but still, where his dad may have said, okay, fine, play your silly game, but you also have to become a lawyer. So, which he did. Eventually his very presence in the game of baseball became a mystery because Moe Berg was not a great baseball player. He was a pretty mediocre player, honestly. He was a sometimes brilliant catcher, especially earlier in his career. Or as one scout famously put it about Berg, he was, quote, good field, no hit, close quote.
Okay. Like some pitchers.
Yeah, and I guess this sort of became like a common phrase, but it started supposedly with Moe Berg. Good field, no hit. And at best, he was, though, an extremely accurate thrower that, really one of the best that ever caught in the major leagues at the very peak for a short amount of time. He once went over 150 games without a single error.
Oh.
Yeah, he threw out, like, a huge number of people 1 or 2 years, like... at the very, very top, he was, like, as good as Yogi Berra. But he didn't have that sustained success. And he also spent many seasons, especially toward the end of his career, intentionally riding the bench. Sometimes refusing to play in games. Famously, he would never catch the second or first game of a doubleheader, which usually the same catcher doesn't do the first and second game of a doubleheader. But if Moe were your backup, Moe would walk up to you, carrying one of his newspapers that he always would carry, and would, say, hey, you did such a great job in the first game, why not go out there again? And you would spend another 3 or 4 hours kneeling down, catching baseballs, because Moe Berg couldn't be bothered to literally do his job.
I was gonna ask why, but, like, we don't know.
We don't
Do
fully
we?
know. No, but, I think that this kind of can best be explained by the fact that Moe Berg, he loved the game of baseball. I mean, he really did. But what he loved more was the lifestyle that the game of baseball afforded him, literally afforded him. He got to stay in fancy hotels and eat, fancy dinners. He always had expensive tastes. And he got to indulge his real great obsession, which was reading. Berg would famously read at least 10 newspapers a day.
That sounds like you.
I know, right? But really, like, from cover to cover.
Wow.
Multiple newspapers, sometimes in supposedly multiple languages, and we'll get into his whole supposed polyglottism. Understanding multiple languages.
Thank you.
Right, and Moe Berg would get incensed, extremely angry, if anyone would so much as touch one of his newspapers until he had read them. Referring to them as, quote, live, until after his perusal, after which they became, quote, dead, and meant absolutely nothing to him. But if he had not read it, and this could be days, weeks later, he would expect you to let them sit there in an office or in a chest of drawers or sitting on a table or, on a chair somewhere. But if he hadn't read it, then you were expected to treat it like it was fucking gold. But as soon as he read it, then it was trash. Again, he's a quirky guy.
Yeah.
So all in all, Moe Berg was a big, mystery to baseball people in general, as this kind of intellectual, polyglot that they named Professor Berg. And they made a lot of this, especially some of the sports writers. Berg was also somewhat apart and sort of othered to his teammates and a lot of people as the rare Jewish player in the major leagues. Moe Berg was, like I said before, Jewish but non-practicing. His parents never went to synagogue. They didn't teach him Judaism. But of course, this was, especially, in the 30s, before that, throughout his entire life, being Jewish was sort of a burden, something he was proud of his heritage, but he wasn't, like, into it religiously. He was kind of a cultural Jew, if that makes sense.
I understand.
And Berg, was also equally a mystery to the sort of bona fide intellectual scientists with whom he would interact. And they were very impressed by him sort of as as the athlete who's also sort of an intellectual. So he was always kind of in between groups, right? He was a Jew who would spend a lot of times with non-Jews. He was a baseball player who'd spend a lot of time with intellectuals, but an intellectual who would spend a lot of time with baseball players.
Right, right.
So he was sort of the consummate outsider. And when I say that, bona fide intellectuals, it's not like Moe Berg didn't have some bona fides as a real, intellectual. He started school at his great insistence at 3.5 when he saw
his great insistence.
Yeah, when he was 3.5 years old and he saw his older brother and sister going to school, he would not stop asking until his parents let him start going to school at 3.5. Yeah, so that tells you something. Eventually, he attended Princeton. After a year at NYU that he thereafter never acknowledged that actually ever happened. He was embarrassed by going to NYU. I don't know. He also attended the Sorbonne in Paris, known as one of the best schools in the world, and also Columbia Law School. And he was accepted at the New York State Bar. He cemented his sort of highbrow status through several appearances on the then popular radio quiz show Information Please, where callers would call in and ask questions of a panel, which also included a guest host, and Moe Berg guest hosted, I was a guest on there rather a few times, and the legend of Professor Berg, like I said before, was sort of further cultivated in the sports press. When there was a slow day, they would write about, Moe Berg and his, great exploits, whatever.
Here's what Moe did today.
Right. They had to have something, so it became about Moe and his, 8, 12, 1,000 languages that he spoke. You know how these things go. Yeah. His, and that's part of the mystery too, right? Is this myth-making surrounding him that he wanted also to be surrounding him. It just, and also just sort of naturally seemed to, to follow Moe. One of the mysteries that fomented these sort of sports writers' interest was just how much language proficiency Moe Berg actually did have, right? Like all supposed polyglots, see recent stories about Pete Buttigieg. Moe Berg was variously ascribed perfect knowledge of, between 7 and 27 languages.
That's a big gap.
Yeah, and this typically happens with people who are ascribed multiple languages. The more people talk about it, the more languages they know, and the better they know them. It sort of feeds on itself.
But 7 as the minimum, I'm impressed.
Right, but to get to demystify this a little bit, as close as we can actually tell, because again, Moe Berg wouldn't deny these things either. If one day you said he knew 8 languages, the next day you said he knew 10, he wasn't going to correct you.
Of course.
But when it came down to telling the government, like the OSS or the CIA, and I'll talk about the OSS in a little bit, what Berg actually knew, and this was kind of in his middle age, he professed a somewhat passable knowledge of 3 to 4 languages, and a sort of more passing knowledge of a couple of others.
Okay.
So he wasn't as much of a he didn't know. A lot of times people say he knew what English, Yiddish, Hebrew, French, Spanish, Italian, and maybe 1 or 2 others. People always like to throw Sanskrit in there. He probably didn't know any of those languages fluently except for French. He was extremely good at French. Native speakers of French would sometimes ask him where he was from in France.
Nice.
Yeah. And he was extremely interested in language, just kind of as a sort of amateur linguist. He could have been a professional linguist. He was offered a job to teach languages at Princeton as soon as he graduated.
Wow.
Which he turned down. Because, again, he wanted to play baseball and become a lawyer. So, again, this tells you about Moe Berg, right?
Priorities.
Yeah, exactly. He had his priorities. The other thing is he was really good in Latin. He would routinely translate like Latin inscriptions. There was one time I think he was at a graduation ceremony, and there was a little like honorary speech given in Latin, and he was like translating it like as it was going. So apparently he was, and that was what he studied first, kind of Latin and Greek and the classical languages. So things like the number of languages he spoke are somewhat difficult to define, like a lot of things about Moe Berg, partly because he quite intentionally created this larger-than-life kind of mythos persona around himself. He was just kind of one of those people, and there's just certain people who want to, make themselves seem like a larger figure than even if they are naturally a large figure, it needs to be like bigger. And in service of this myth-making, Berg would relay tales. He was a great, great storyteller, and part of what made his stories really great was that he would tend to embellish a little bit. So whether, it was about his spy work, his early baseball brilliance, whatever, it was always just a little bit more. And some of these tales, would be completely true, but sometimes Berg would get caught in a kind of half-truth or embellishment and would admit it. So we know that this is like a tendency that he had.
So we know that he... Okay.
So, in other words, he was a great storyteller, but not a terribly reliable narrator.
Okay.
And you certainly couldn't take what he said as fact about himself. And this is, again, one of these kind of mysterious things about him. He never actually wrote an autobiography. You'd think that he would have written some kind of memoir or something. Just the amount of time that he spent talking about himself and relaying these stories, to people verbally. But apparently he tried multiple times and wasn't able to do it. Like, we have like notes that he started, and it would just kind of peter out. He would start by writing like sentences and paragraphs, and then it would just turn into like notes, and then it would just peter out. Again, we don't really know why, because he retold certain scenes from his life literally thousands, tens of thousands of times over the years. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about a couple of these incidents that are more or less mysterious. So one of the incidents that Moe would kind of endlessly recall to people, mainly in his later years, occurred during his trip to Japan in 1934. So Japan is, of course, one of the other great baseball nations, right? Other than America.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Sure. If you don't know too much about baseball history, you may not know, but yes, it was brought over to Japan fairly early on, and Japan was the second nation in the world with a professional baseball league, for example. Okay. So it was quite popular there. And in 1934, there was a trip organized with some great players. Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig. Among them was Moe Berg. And people kind of wonder a little bit why he was there, because he was not a Babe Ruth. He was not a Lou Gehrig. He was not one of the greats. But what he was again, kind of a linguist and someone who was really interested in world affairs and things of that nature, and no one's really sure, whether he talked to the government before he went or not. That's kind of a mystery. And we'll kind of get in a little bit here as to why some people might think that as well. But their main reason for being there was promoting baseball, teaching baseball to the Japanese. And Moe, who again was fascinated with languages his whole life, learned some Japanese on the 2-week voyage to Tokyo from Hawaii. But he didn't become like fluent in Japanese in 2 weeks, which is what some of the reports said, and what he himself, led people to believe sometimes.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's not true. No one can learn a fluent language in 2 weeks.
I can.
That's ridiculous. Moe also ventured out and sort of partook of much more of the culture than his teammates. On one occasion, Berg also told everyone that he was going to go visit the daughter of the American ambassador in Tokyo, who had just given birth to a daughter.
Oh.
And she was, there in the hospital, right? So Moe puts on a kimono and goes to the hospital, presumably to, visit the ambassador's daughter. Doesn't do that. He takes the flowers they brought for her, throws them away, goes up to the very top of the building, one of the highest buildings in Japan, takes out a film camera from under his kimono, and even though it was expressly forbidden for anyone to take any photographs, especially foreigners, he takes his time, fully aware of this, in creating a panorama video of the city of Tokyo and sort of the surrounding area. Now, why exactly he did this remains somewhat of a mystery.
That's some spy shit right there.
This at least points to the fact that he was always in this spying mindset. I think Moe Berg was always fated to be a spy, and people would say this to him, like even before he became, even people who didn't know that he would become a spy or was a spy, be like, Mo, you're like a spy, you just seem like a spy. For example, he would wear like the same gray suit every day. He was one of those people where people weren't sure whether he had more than one suit or not. He was also one of those people who like literally had like 8 of the same suit, the same shirt, the same ties.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
like a cartoon character.
Yeah, exactly. But in real life.
Yeah.
So again, this is spy-like behavior, right? But even back in 1934, he was doing this. Now, some claim that he was already working as a spy for the government even back then, but it's not really totally clear whether that's the case or not. What we do know, though, is that Berg continued to illicitly film and photograph throughout the long solo trip that he took subsequent to Japan. Most people just went back to America, not Moe. Moe was like, I am not wasting this opportunity. He went all throughout Asia. He went to, and then he went all the way across Russia on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. So he literally took a train like all the way across the continent. And once he got to Moscow, he was caught twice filming illicitly. Literally like tap on the shoulder, like, what are you doing? Give me your camera, give me your film. And when he was leaving the country, which, of course, you get caught twice filming, you're like, okay, I'm going to pee.
It's time to go.
Probably time to go. He did manage to smuggle 2 rolls of film out of the country, which he was forever showing people. Which wouldn't you? I mean, you have film from these places that no one else has.
Isn't that going to get you arrested?
No, not in America. In America, no one's going to care whether you illegally filmed in Japan and Russia. So eventually, Berg and this is why I don't think that he was working for the government at the time, because later, like years and years later, once World War II started, once Pearl Harbor had happened, right? He presented these films to the American government and other photographs that he had taken, for whatever use they could put them to. And what is also a mystery, sort of within the mystery, is to what extent these films that Berg made had any real strategic value to the military. Yeah.
To me, it seems like he might have been taking these pictures just to see if he could do it.
That's what it seems like to me. Like he was just sort of thrill-seeking.
Yeah.
Which it seems like Moe Berg, that he was a thrill-seeker.
Right.
And
it makes sense with the narrative.
Oh, sure. And I think it also points to the fact that he was fearless, which he definitely was. Like throughout his life, he just seemed to have nerves of steel, which again, good for a spy. So Berg would later claim that these films and photographs were key to particularly General Jimmy Doolittle's air raid mission over Tokyo in 1942. However, others dispute this and claim that they had little, if any, practical usefulness for the military, partly because they were pretty outdated by that point. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. It seems like maybe they were used, but maybe they had limited utility for the military. But it, again, should be kept in mind that Moe Berg's a pretty famous embellisher. So, I don't think they were as key to the war effort as he made them out to seem.
Grain of salt.
Yeah, grain of salt. So, another sort of the other big, or I should say maybe the one big kind of like spy mission that Moe Berg conducted, right? Which again, he was like always telling people about. Sometimes too much. Like apparently sometimes he like divulged too much detail to certain people about his spy work, like stuff he really wasn't supposed to tell people, but not until years and years later. So anyway, Berg's sort of seminal mission as a true-to-life spy during World War II involved one of the biggest mysteries during the war. Was Nazi Germany close to developing a nuclear weapon? No one knew. At the time, it was very unclear. Now, spoiler alert, they didn't. They weren't close. We know that now, but at the time, it was a big mystery. So, particularly in 1944, when Goebbels and the German propaganda machine were telling people essentially that they did have a nuclear bomb. So, as part of his work, Berg's work for the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the modern-day CIA. The Office of Strategic Services was like the first spy service, formal spy service that our government ever had. Moe Berg was sent into Europe to assess the likelihood of a German bomb. And he gathered intelligence from various scientists throughout Europe, mainly Italian scientists. But the big prize was Werner Heisenberg. Werner Heisenberg, if you sort of know physicists, if you're interested in the history of science like I am, you'll know that Werner Heisenberg was one of the real towering figures in modern science.
Big name.
Big name. Probably known as, and of course this is at a time when you had Niels Bohr and Fermi and Einstein. Heisenberg may have been the most brilliant theoretical physicist of all of them. It would be sort of between him and Einstein. Einstein, you could say, was the more brilliant physicist at the macro scale, whereas Heisenberg was the more brilliant theoretical physicist at the quantum scale. Heisenberg mainly is known as the definer of this uncertainty principle, right? Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which underlies a lot of our modern understanding of quantum physics at the smallest scales. But despite its great importance, Heisenberg's famous theory, the uncertainty principle, is also, like a lot of things in quantum physics, almost completely impossible to understand, to truly understand. However, apparently, after a lot of study, Moe Berg was able to sort of vaguely understand it. Okay. And because he was, able to quickly learn difficult subjects like quantum physics, nuclear physics, also because he had a facility with languages and his ability to, like we've been talking about, right, mold social situations around him and sort of, fit in wherever he was. Moe Berg was the ideal candidate to attend a lecture that Heisenberg was giving in neutral Switzerland, in Zurich, to assess the likelihood of a German bomb and to shoot Heisenberg if the bomb seemed imminent. Yeah, he literally had a pistol and a cyanide capsule. And if he determined, either the lecture that he attended or through the walk that he took with Werner Heisenberg through the ill-lit streets of Zurich.
Oh my god.
The perfect setting, right? That if at any time he felt like, okay, they're close to making the bomb, it was goodbye Werner.
Pop, pop, bitch.
Exactly. So, yeah, he didn't, though. He sort of, determined that it didn't seem like they were particularly close, which, helped to sort of solve this mystery and allay the fears of, the Americans.
Well, thank God he was right.
Right. And though, as with much about Moe Berg, it remains a bit unclear the extent to which this mission was key in assessing Germany's nuclear development. Certainly it was important, but there were also parallel missions, unbeknownst to Berg at the time, going on with the same exact mission. And there were other sources of intelligence as well. So, Berg would maintain that his trip in Zurich in 1944, sort of totally changed the course of the war, but it was probably not that simple, right? But because of these, wartime exploits, among others, and the lobbying of some powerful friends, Berg was awarded the Medal of Freedom several years later. Mysteriously, he refused to accept it, and no one really knows why.
But he lobbied for it?
He didn't. Some of his friends did.
Okay.
And some speculate that Berg may have thought that his actions in the war, as impressive as they truly were, didn't merit that big of an award. Again, he never seemed to really live up to his own expectations. And, this sort of, speaks to the last sort of part of his life, right? The last 20 to 25 years of his life, which are kind of a mystery in and of themselves, particularly... What did he do? What did he do all day? What did he do for money? For the last, 20 to 25 years of his life.
We just don't know?
We don't really know. It's more or less mysterious.
I'm confused.
There are large portions of his time where they're just kind of not accounted for. And he didn't have any regular job for the last, 20 to 25 years he lived. Despite his evident brilliance, his knowledge of the law, languages, baseball, he chose, apparently, not to maintain a regular gainful employment, for that time period. And it's not really, clear exactly what he was doing all of that time. Now, if Berg had his way, he would have become one of the lucky few, about 1,000 out of about 13,000, who went from the OSS to the CIA. But that was very rare. Again, they went from about 13,000 OSS employees to about 1,000 CIA employees at the beginning. So there weren't many. He would always kind of intimate that he was still a spy, but it wasn't true. He wasn't actually a spy, apparently. He may have done a little bit of work, but he wasn't really a spy for the last part of his life. And many people wondered exactly what he did for a living, how he survived. And the best explanation I was able to come up with was that he essentially sold stories. He became a kind of, traveling bard who would, delight and entertain his audiences in exchange for, food and housing, essentially. And, he also stayed with his brother. He stayed in his brother's house on and off for about 17 years until his brother just couldn't take it anymore, and he moved in with his sister. Now, Moe Berg's brother and sister absolutely hated each other. They lived a few blocks away from each other and never spoke for 30 years. Almost at all. Only when they absolutely had to. They just hate it, and no one really knows why either. That's another mystery. They also
There's so many whys here.
So many whys. Again, this mystery abounds around this guy. So, part of the reason also why, he was this sort of just kind of a bum, apparently he hated to work. He didn't like being on a regular schedule. He didn't like people telling him what to do. So he was offered, and a couple of times accepted, but didn't really keep them, various jobs that he would eventually just kind of flake on. And, while he was incompetent as an employee, he was sort of a great guest, he was called. He became very, very used to being a guest. In fact, for portions of his life, even some of his close biographers don't know exactly where he lived, because he would just be constantly traveling. When he would or even when he was in one city, he would change residences. He would live in hotels and hostels. He never, other than his brother and sister's house, really had a permanent residence. Sometimes he would also just kind of show up in a town, pull out his notebook of phone numbers because he just had like people he knew, and he would just call him up and say, "Hey, this is Moe. I'm gonna show up at this time." It's like, let's go out. I'm staying at your house. Yeah, he
Oh
would
my
just
God.
invite himself.
Yes, I will be staying at your house.
But it worked because he was Moe Berg, and like being in his presence to him was the payment. Like that's what he was giving. He was giving you the privilege of him staying with you.
But it was successful.
But it was successful.
Because usually stuff like that makes you like an arrogant prick, not
Right,
you know.
but Moe Berg was also incredibly charming and like engaging. So when he was staying with you, he was generally like a great guy to have around. He would regale the family with stories, stories of his exploits as a spy, stories of his travels through Asia and Europe, stories about playing with Babe Ruth and Ted Williams. But for some, hearing the same stories, some obviously embellished, really began to wear. And when it became obvious he wasn't wanted anymore, Berg would generally make himself scarce, without saying anything. He would just be gone. And sometimes even not when he wasn't wanted anymore. He would just be gone. He wouldn't tell you where he was going, what he was doing, why he was leaving, that he was going to leave. He would just not be there.
Like after baseball games.
Exactly. Like, it's kind of a recurring theme through his whole life. Sometimes he would say he was coming for a few nights, and he would come for a few weeks. He would often overstay his welcome.
Yeah.
Another quirk about Moe Berg is that he would take routinely up to 2 to 3 showers a day, which also would probably get a little annoying. Berg also intentionally never learned to drive and never got a driver's license, so he would need constant chauffeuring around. And he also, in this last part of his life, almost never paid for anything. Sometimes this was because he was the famous Moe Berg, and he was, near the Red Sox stadium, and, your money's no good here, Mr. Berg. Sometimes it was because he was with rich friends who would just pay.
Yeah.
Now, there is one notable...
That's the way to go.
Right. There is one notable, sort of mysterious exception to this. While he was consoling a friend's wife, whom the friend had just left and kind of told Moe to tell her, which is kind of weird, Berg would, for 2 months straight, take her out to fancy dinners and pay for everything. But it's not clear, like even to the writer of the book where I got a lot of my information, exactly where Berg got the money for this. Because around this time, he wasn't paying for anything. He was just bumming meals like he always did. And the woman's husband, who was wealthy, says that he wasn't giving Berg the money. So we really don't know where this money was coming from. It remains a mystery. Now, on a darker note, one kind of has to mention this about Moe Berg too, that he may have been sort of a sexual assaulter. We don't really know, but there were a couple of sort of odd / disturbing stories about him making a couple of preteen girls very uncomfortable. And also some stories of what amounts to sexual assault or harassment.
Well,
like grabbing women without their consent, etc.
Well, it's kind of weird that he was taking someone else's wife out to fancy, expensive dinners.
Well, that was after he had left her. But he also wasn't, like, pursuing her. Which was another weird thing. Like, sometimes he would, like, take a woman out, like, spend a lot of time with her, but never really, like, pursue anything. Just his whole, like, sexual, romantic life is very, very mysterious. He was kind of known as a ladies' man and would routinely be seen, and photographed out with beautiful young women, but always a different one. And he never, from what we can tell, like with letters and kind of background interviews and stuff that have been done, he didn't usually seem to pursue a physical relationship with these women. And certainly no, like, lasting relationship.
Yeah.
So, he was sort of fascinating and inscrutable, sometimes intolerable, but always mysterious and always interesting. And because of, Moe Berg's unwillingness to divulge personal details, while also weirdly talking about himself constantly, and his inability to maintain any close relationships in his life, Moe Berg really remains kind of a man of mystery. And I was going to close out here with a couple of quotes. So first, quote from Paul Rudd, the great Paul Rudd, who played Moe Berg in one of the recent movies that was made about him, which we should watch. So Paul Rudd said of Berg, quote, "He wasn't someone who particularly wanted to be known. He found pleasure in the unknowable." Close quote. I love that quote. He found pleasure in the unknowable.
I feel like that's us.
I know, right? He embraced the mystery, as we all should. And last of all, here's a quote from Moe Berg himself, about himself, not long before he passed in 1972. Quote, "Maybe I'm not in the Cooperstown Baseball Hall of Fame like so many of my baseball buddies, but I'm happy I had the chance to play pro ball, and am especially proud of my contributions to my country. Perhaps I could not hit like Babe Ruth, but I spoke more languages than he did." Close quote.
No brag, no brag.
That reminds me of another quote. Somebody saying, like, yeah, Moe Berg, he can speak 12 languages and he can't hit in any of them.
Oh,
that quote came up many times in my research.
Burn. So what are the books you listened to / read?
Yeah, definitely. So, The Catcher Was a Spy. It was the name of the audiobook that I listened to.
That's clever.
Right, by Nicholas Dawidoff. It's one of two sort of main biographies about Moe Berg. My other sources were Shirley Loing at Boston Globe, Bruce Fetz at the New York Times, the Moe Berg page on CIA.gov, the Moe Berg page on Atomic Heritage Foundation, their website, Manuel Roig Franzia at the Washington Post, Wikipedia, the Moe Berg page, Jonathan Mark at the Times of Israel, and Ralph Berger at the Society for American Baseball Research.
Wow.
So that is the mysterious Moe Berg.
Okay, so I don't know how to follow that. I don't know how to follow that. So I'm going to just go ahead and
Just do it.
jump in here.
Jump in.
Okay, so I have,
I'm rooting for you.
My computer screen is so gross, in case anybody was wondering. Okay.
Cool.
I'm like scraping off crud.
If we ever do a video version, you can see our gross
It's like
computer screen.
hair all over it. All right. So I am talking about, this is pretty dark. It's not dark. I mean, all of it's dark, but it's the true, I mean, a lot of missing people have that kind of thing where they straight up disappear, vanish, never to be seen again. And those ones are so, in my opinion, so difficult to cover because there's usually nothing there. Like, there's nothing to talk about except that they were there one day and then they weren't.
Right.
But Rico Harris, he was an up-and-coming basketball player, and he was definitely supposed to go pro, but a lot of alcohol abuse, a lot of drug abuse got in his way until he finally vanished one day. So let's talk about it. So Rico Harris was 6'9", 300-pound basketball player, and he suddenly went missing in October of 2014. So he was shy, he was soft-spoken, kind of timid, but he was a free spirit. And grew up in a 2-bedroom duplex, and he was the oldest of 4 siblings. And so his parents, his mother, Margaret Fernandez, she worked really hard, full-time job, helped support the family. Meanwhile, his father, Henry, although Margaret and Fernandez, or Henry and Margaret did start out as having a good marriage, and they were inseparable and stuff like that. Eventually, Henry became very violent and very abusive. And in the couple articles I read, I even recalled a moment when he beat up Rico because he had like some new piercing or something like that. Eventually, Margaret did get up and leave. She left that bastard. And at one point, Rico even tried to make amends with his father, but his father like straight up told him, he was like, "I am not fit to be a dad.
Yeah.
Goodbye."
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of rough when your
Yeah.
when your father says that to you. So they moved to the suburb of Alhambra, California, which is right near Los Angeles. And so, like I said, Rico was always a tall dude, always loved basketball, and he started out at Fremont Elementary School, and he was actually playing with adults, like playing pickup basketball with adults at the gym by the time he was 11.
Wow.
He wanted to make basketball a career, and he wanted to carve out a better life for himself and also for his mother. He grew up worshiping Magic Johnson and the glory that was the Los Angeles Lakers at the time in the about mid to late 90s here. So he started out high school at Hollywood High, but eventually left to go to Temple City High School. And in high school, he was originally shy and withdrawn, but he did find a peace and found a little haven in playing basketball. And in high school, he met Melinda Young, who would be his long-term girlfriend. They did eventually break up, but at the time, they got together very quickly, and they fell in love very quickly. Just described her as the love of his life. She was also very academically inclined, and as was he. So with her by his side and her motivation, along with Harris's own hard work, he graduated with a 3.0. So he only played 2 years of high school basketball, because he went to Hollywood High, and then his junior year went to the Temple City High School. But he was already super talented, and basketball scouts flocked to go see him play. He averaged 28 points and 15 rebounds during his senior season.
Wow.
Yes, and was recognized along with future NBA players Paul Pierce, Jason Terry, and Chauncey Billups. He was recognized as one of the top players from the Western United States.
Wow.
And
just if you're not into basketball, I mean, especially Paul Pierce is like a historical player.
Yeah.
But all three of those are like high level NBA players for many, many years.
Well, Rico was on the way.
Wow.
It's a tragic story, because he really was up there. So after he graduated high school, he was offered to play by some of the top college basketball teams. Connecticut wanted him, Kentucky wanted him, Arizona wanted him, UCLA wanted him.
Wow.
And they were throwing scholarships his way. So he chose Arizona, but this is when he started getting into trouble. So in March of 1996, he was arrested for an incident involving teammates G. Gervin, who is the son of NBA Hall of Famer George Gervin.
The Iceman.
And Tommy Prince. So 2 women ended up accusing the players of holding them against their will and forcing them to perform sex acts. While all 3 of them were arrested, they were eventually arrested on suspicion of false imprisonment. Harris was the only one not accused of the more serious charge of sexual assault, and eventually all the charges were dropped, and nothing ever really came of it, because investigators stated that the women gave conflicting stories and nothing ever really added up to anything solid and incredible to keep.
Make a charge.
Right. So nonetheless, ASU officials were like, that's terrible, and that's not okay. He was asked to sit out for a season, but he refused. He got up and he left, and he went home. He went back home to be with his mother and his girlfriend. So when he left Arizona State, he eventually went back to school, and he went to LA City College, and he found success there. So in 1997, Rico led the school to their first state title, a 67-62 victory over San Jose College. So it is a bit of a downfall for him to go from Arizona State to an unnamed Los Angeles college, but at this point in his life, he was kind of down, and he was also very he was very attached to his home and his family, and he wanted to stay in that area. That happened a lot as I was reading the two articles that I had, and going through his education and stuff like that. He often would move back home, just go back home. So he led the school to their first state title, and he received a winner's medal and the state MVP trophy. A few weeks later, Harris signed on. He committed to Jim Herrick's revival at the University of Rhode Island. So Jim was trying to build up a good basketball team, a good basketball program to represent the university. Lamar Odom was on the list, and Zach Marbury was on the list, and Rico was next. Mm-hmm. So he only had to pass one class at LACC in order to go to Rhode Island, which was a psychology course, but he stopped going to class, and he failed the course, and so the transfer was blocked. He did not end up going. So he later went home, but then he did return to Los Angeles City College, even though he didn't really want to be there, but he also couldn't let go of basketball. And at that point, it wasn't challenging enough. He was playing against people who were not of his caliber at all. Things, got worse and worse. He started drinking heavily. He did a lot of partying with his brother Tito, who he shared an apartment with near campus. One of his former teammates, Derek Anderson, I have a quote from him. He talks about when Harris showed up to a game, after a long night out. Quote, "I'll never forget. We were playing at home, and he came in, and we were already in the layup line, and he got in the warm-up line with black sunglasses on. He probably didn't get no sleep and up all night, then dropped 35 that game." End quote. So his scoring average went up, but also his drinking activities went up. So as you can tell, there was a lot going on with Harris at this time. He continued to drink. It got more frequent. At one point, he was nursing his hangovers with beer. Him and his girlfriend, Melinda Young, rarely spoke. They eventually broke up. And he used to always head home on the weekends, but he stopped going home on the weekends. He spent a lot of time isolated and alone. He was ditching practices. It was going downhill. College recruiters would come by the gym and watch, but Harris never opened their letters or returned their responses. He felt that, okay, so he had this weird thing with college coaches. He felt that they were pushy, and he felt that they were looking at ability and not his character. They were only telling him what he wanted to hear. So what he ended up doing was he bypassed the 4-year college thing and went straight to the 1998 NBA draft. Mm-hmm. So he got invited. He even was invited to a pre-draft camp up in Chicago. Mm-hmm. But a few days before it started, he lost hope, lost faith. He pulled his name out of the draft consideration. I think the quote was something along the lines of he was tired of the pressure. He was tired of trying to live up to all of these expectations, and it was too much. And he still wasn't ready to leave home. And he made a kind of surprising move by calling up the head coach at Cal State Northridge named Bobby Braswell. So they had actually formed a kind of a casual relationship 3 years earlier when he was being recruited. And at this point, Rico Harris felt like that he needed discipline and that Braswell was the person that he could trust. So at that point, he goes to Northridge and he starts playing ball over there. But he still never kicked his alcohol habit. Alcohol for him was a constant that was always there, right? And while sometimes people and relationships weren't, and he was always going from school to school, always had all these opportunities open to him, but he always lost hope. And so things were passing by him very quickly, except for alcohol. That was always there. It was always constant.
Seems like it's a lot of self-sabotage.
Yeah, a lot of depression, which I could feel.
Yeah,
I could definitely feel that.
It's very, very tragic, but it's definitely a kind of story I've heard before.
Yeah.
Where, a player, they have, like, a lot of physical ability, but they're just a little too, I don't know, I think it's a lot of times these smarter players, where they're a little too cerebral. They're a little too self-conscious.
Yeah, too in their heads.
Yeah, so it just like it's all like a little bit too much, like
right.
mentally, even if like physically they're perfectly capable.
Right. And he was kind of shy and kept to himself to begin with, and sometimes, especially when you're feeling sad and you've got all those feelings to feel and shit's not going right and your dad's hitting you, you got to talk to somebody about that. But he, presumably, as far as I know, most likely never did.
Yeah.
So he did start playing ball at Northridge, and then, like I said, he could not kick that habit. So he was suspended early in his first season, and NBA recruiters stopped coming. They noticed this habit. And when he was about to, after his suspension, when he was about to be reinstated, he was supposed to go to a meeting with Braswell, but he never showed up, and he left the school entirely.
Wow.
So at this point, he stopped going to school, and the International Basketball League's not around anymore, but he did bounce around there. He played with the San Diego Stingrays and the St. Louis Storm for a while, until the spring of 2000, when he got a gig with the Harlem Globetrotters, but it only lasted a month. And it all came crashing down for good on a night out with a girl in South Los Angeles. So this is kind of, along with the alcohol abuse, his downfall. And at this point, it was really out of his control. So he had an argument with another group of people. Basically, he got out of his car to confront them, and while talking to one of them, someone picked up a baseball bat and whacked him across the back of the head. Never the same since. Never the same. He had intense headaches. His balance was off. He couldn't play. It was over. He quit, and he went back home. So at this point, he's still young. He's 24. In 2001, he's 24. So for about 6 years, between 2001 and 2007, it really spiraled out. He faced 16 cases in LA County Superior Court on a slew of charges, most of them being public intoxication, some of them burglary, some of them trespassing. He was in and out of jail all the time. He was eventually diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and he was put on medication. But like many, many people do, he stopped taking his medication because it didn't make him feel right.
Right.
Didn't like how it made him feel. And he started to move on to even harder drugs like crack, meth, heroin. And I have a quote from his childhood friend, David Lara. Quote, "It's a local tragedy. He was the best ball player this city ever saw, and then you'd see him in the street, drunk and asking for quarters. It was despair, bro. It was down there. It was the darkest of the dark." End quote. So he did have a wake-up call. His wake-up call came when he overdosed on prescription pills. So his mother found him, in his bed, choking on his own vomit, convulsing, called the paramedics, got him to the hospital, got his stomach pumped, and he was out 2 days later. At that point, he was like, this is his childhood friend and the people around him. He just kind of realized now, and David Lara said, if you keep doing this, you're going to end up dead. Mm-hmm. So he checked himself into the Salvation Army Adult Rehabilitation Center in downtown LA. And this is where he started to rebuild his life. And things started to brighten up for him. So and it took a while, which, I mean that doesn't really necessarily mean anything, but in my opinion, I looked at it as that he had a lot to work on, and he wanted to work hard, and he wanted to do it right. Mm-hmm. And he got a job at the rehab center. He went to group meetings. and like I said, he spent a lot of time in recovery, and he just wanted to feel like himself again. He made amends with his family and his friends. He went on to mentor others, and soon he volunteered at a shelter himself. And then once he left the rehab center, he got a job and began working long hours as a security detail. So when he had been sober for 7 years, he met Jennifer Song, a 34-year-old insurance broker, and she was in town visiting from Seattle, and they met at a party, and they hit it off immediately. And so he hadn't had a close, long-term relationship since high school, so he was really into this, and they took it slow. They were super happy together. It was a long distance relationship. She would fly out to California from Seattle and visit him, and they spent long weekends together, and they soon talked about marriage and kids. So eventually he went to Seattle and he moved in with Jennifer. But the thing is about this, and the mom explained it perfectly, that every time they saw each other, it was like a honeymoon, right? So now that they were living with each other and they were with each other constantly, there was friction.
The bloom was off the rose.
It wasn't the same. His mother and his former roommate voiced their concerns, saying that Jennifer was kind of controlling as well. They did share a Facebook account. They shared credit cards, and they shared a bank account. And so once they started living together and things started to crumble apart, he relapsed. He started drinking again, and he lost his job, started drinking even more. Eventually, he did score an interview for a new job in Seattle with a real estate company. And October 8th, 2014, he drove from Seattle back to his hometown, Alhambra, to collect some of his belongings to prepare for this new job, and to speak to his mom and to his brother, just to talk to them about what's going on, because he's not at a great point right now. I have a quote from his mom, quote, "The last conversation with me, he wasn't in a good place and he had to clear his mind," end quote. So after speaking with his mother about his relapse, agreeing that he tried to get better, and he had lunch with his brother, Rico Harris left in his black Nissan Maxima back to Seattle. Leaving Alhambra, he drove north on Interstate 5. Records show that he stopped in Lodi, 40 miles south of Sacramento, to fill up on gas. At 10:45 a.m. on October 10th, he called his girlfriend from north of Sacramento and left a message saying that he was going, quote, "up into the mountains to rest," end quote. Since at this point he had been driving and he'd been awake for more than 30 hours. At 11:15 that night, he turned the phone off, and no one has heard from Rico Harris or positively identified him since then.
Wow.
Just vanished. So 3 days later, October 13th, 2014, Officer Danny Del Castillo noticed the black Nissan on the side of the road on Interstate 5, just doing patrols, making sure that nothing seemed weird, out of the ordinary. He took note of it, and then the next day when he saw it again in the same spot, he was like, "That's not good, red flags." So he checked the registration, ran the plates, and he got Rico Harris's name. So he called back the sheriff's office, and they said, let's talk to the hometown. Let's talk to the local police department where the car is from. So they contacted the police in Alhambra and learned that the owner of the car, Rico Harris, hadn't been seen in 4 days. So they searched the car. The gas tank was empty, the battery was dead, and the interior was totally ransacked. There were CDs everywhere, credit cards, papers, all scattered across the floor. His wallet was found, but his driver's license wasn't in there. There was no cash in the wallet. So at this point, they sent out a search and rescue team, and they scoured a 27-mile stretch along Route 16. There were dogs. They got helicopters. There was a team out on the land and motorcycles that took to to the terrain to go scour the land. And there was an airplane. They even had a plane equipped with a heat sensing device that flew overhead. 3 days later, the rescue efforts slowed. There was no body and very few clues as to where he could be. Also, things do get a little bit weird in that not long after the car was found, his cell phone and backpack were also found. I think it was like a few miles away from his car. And in the backpack were some jumper cables, a few pieces of clothing, and 2 bottles. One of them was empty, one of them was half full, and it reeked of energy drink and alcohol. So the lead detective, Sergeant Dean Nyland, he went on, took the lead, and he searched through each message and each phone call. He went through that phone. He pinged cell phone towers to try to figure out his last locations. He saw text messages to Harris's brother. He saw the text to his roommate. He saw the calls to his mother and to his girlfriend. There was really nothing unusual on there. He found a series of photos and videos. Quote, the videos, according to Nyland, were taken as if by accident late Friday night, after Harris was supposed to be in Seattle. It's nearly dark, and what can be heard, the detective says, is Harris singing out of tune and tossing the contents of his wallet and CDs across the car, clanking against the panel and steering wheel, end quote. So it seemed like it was taken by accident and just something that ended up on his phone. Oddly enough, Rico had been sighted a few times after he went missing. So on Saturday, the day of his job interview in Seattle, an eyewitness spotted him at 5:30 a.m. sitting on a guardrail overlooking the creek some 500 yards from where his phone and backpack were found. Another person called in with a tip saying that they saw him walking along Route 16 at around 8 a.m. So 4 days after they had that initial search, a deputy found tracks in the sand by a creek called Cache Creek, and he found those around noon, and they weren't there earlier in the day. They weren't animal tracks, and they were large enough to be Harris's size, 18 feet. So Detective Nyland, they're not getting anywhere. He goes and interviews the family. He asks Jennifer Song, the girlfriend, why she hadn't filed a missing persons report even when the police got in contact with his mother, and she said that she was having conversations with the mother and saying that they agreed to wait to see if he would show up on his own. One of the articles talked about how Rico Harris sometimes would go out and drive, like he loved to drive, and he would be gone for hours at a time just to clear his mind. So in that sense, it kind of makes sense in that context to have him see if he just came back on his own. So at this point, they widen the search. They bring out cadaver dogs. They checked homeless shelters. They looked into transient camps, but there was nothing, zero. I have a quote from the Detective Nyland here. Quote, initially, he probably voluntarily walked away or got a ride. We have no sightings, so he probably got a ride. But how does this guy not pop up somewhere? I mean, big guy has to eat 3 or 4 times a day. I can see how a lot of people who don't stand out can disappear, but this guy stands out. End quote. So Nyland guesses that maybe Rico Harris went out to buy meth, but even if he did or if he didn't, that really doesn't tell us anything. It maybe says that messes with the timeline a little bit, like maybe he ran out of gas or he made a wrong turn. He left his car, went off to buy drugs, wandered the area for a few days, and went back to find his car gone, only to walk off somewhere and find a ride? ? Maybe. To this day, family, friends, and investigators are still looking for Rico, and the detective doesn't suspect foul play. So it's tricky. It's very puzzling, because what got me was that they haven't found a body. So if he OD'd somewhere, I bet he's a John Doe somewhere, you know?
Yeah, it's really, really, who knows?
Yeah.
But yeah, those, like, videos at the end, that's very strange.
Yeah.
Like, maybe he was having some kind of breakdown at the very end.
Definitely,
But then
he
again,
was
you
not
would
in
think,
the right mind.
You know, if he just wandered off into the desert, they would have found him.
Yeah.
I mean, they would have found if not him alive, they would have found his body.
Yeah, they did multiple searches over a course of a few months. So I have a quote from his mother, quote, "This is a pain that's deep, that goes down to your core. It's like you're on a merry-go-round and can't get off. Nothing is going to quiet the pain. Nothing is going to make it go away. He could be alive. Maybe he's not. I don't know what the truth is. I don't know. People don't just vanish." End quote.
But sometimes they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very strange. It reminds me of in the 27 Club episode, who was the artist that just like walked away, or that they just like never saw again.
Oh, she left a bar, and then they never saw her again. I don't recall her name either.
Anyway, yeah, that was a good one.
Weird, right?
Yeah, very weird.
Yeah, I'm usually weird about missing person cases, but this one went deep. I was like, this one's something. This one's also so frustrating, and the detective talked about this too. Like, there's something there. I just feel like we're missing something, you know. Right. So I found two really good articles. One was an LA Times article by Nathan Fenno, and the other was a foxsports.com article by Flinder Boyd. And I use some Wikipedia, but Wikipedia mostly, and this is what I usually use Wikipedia for, Wikipedia mostly helps me organize like how I'm going to relay the story, right, but also gives me links. And Wikipedia was what gave me that Fox Sports article, and it was a long form article, and it was good.
Okay, cool.
So, yeah, that is the disappearance of Rico Harris.
Cool. Okay, so do you want to do some
weird shit in the news? Dude, I got some
weird shit?
I got some crazy shit right here. So
that's cray in a good way right there.
Oh my God, shut up, Cleveland. There's a reason that show didn't last. Okay, and we talked about this. I actually went through this 3 days ago. I have a article from the Telegraph in the UK, in the United Kingdom. That was terrible. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done it. Quote, "Seagulls keep couple hostage in their own home for 6 days by attacking them every time they leave the house." This is actually wild. So they were nesting. And every time this couple, Roy and Brenda Pickard, 71, they were constantly confronted by these two adult seagulls after two chicks ended up on the roof. So Mr. Pickard was so viciously attacked that he ended up with a bloody head wound that needed hospital treatment. So yeah, this shit is it's weird. Quote, "The whole thing has been terrible. I've not been able to go out the front door. If I try to get out of the door, the two adult birds are right there and I've got no chance. It's genuinely frightening." He adds, "My wife isn't well or very mobile at the moment, so we're relying on me to get out. Thankfully, we have an integrated garage and I can get into it from the kitchen, open the garage door, drive out to get our shopping. But I have to leave the garage door open, which isn't ideal." So, and because they're a certain type of seagull, they're herring gulls and they're protected when they're nesting, they really didn't have a lot of options. Yeah. A council spokesman said, quote, "We sympathize with Mr. Pickard's situation. Seagulls can be troublesome, particularly when nesting. We have visited Mr. Pickard to assess the situation and have given advice on how he can deal with the gulls. They have a solution in place that will enable him to take his wife to her private appointments." Yeah. They advise residents to bird-proof their properties prior to the breeding season.
Always a good idea.
Is your place bird-proof?
Bird poop?
Bird poof?
Is your place bird poop?
Boof purd?
What?
Do you have one?
I have some good shit in the news.
What is it?
Oh my god. So, this one's a little bit old, but I meant to do it on when we were like gonna do an episode and then we didn't. But anyway, here it is. This is an article from the Washington Post by Allie Karen, entitled "Doctors Said She Wouldn't Live to Her First Birthday. She Just Went to Prom with 2 dates."
Oh, yes! My
So,
bitch!
This
I love her already.
I know. So this was a story about Gabby Horner Shepherd, who, like they said in the article, wasn't expected to live past or even to her first birthday. She was born with this rare genetic disorder called partial trisomy 13, and essentially her development mentally was stopped at the age of like 18 months. So although she's 21 years old, she has the abilities and understanding of an infant, essentially. But she was, because of her special needs, allowed to continue to attend high school until 21, at which time she was going to graduate. And
Awesome.
yeah, which is a great story in and of itself, right? Her mom is just super dedicated to her and making her life like as fulfilling and meaningful as she like possibly can. And she has 11 people who are helping her throughout the day.
Oh, that's awesome. So she's got a team.
She has truly a whole team around her.
And she is the queen.
And when she, was going to go to prom, her mom, solicited, dates for her, so she could have like a real prom experience.
Yeah.
And many, dozens of men, sort of stepped forward, but 2 seemed like just right. One was a student at a local university, Zach Bowman, who attended Brock University, and he said when he saw her story, that it kind of really resonated with him because he had some issues in his own life, some substance abuse issues, and a suicide attempt. Yeah. And he just really felt like, it was kind of fate that he and she would meet, and they've stayed in contact and everything. And the other escort was the coach of a special needs hockey team that she competed on. So and he's also an officer. So those were her 2 dates, and they went and they had a great time, and it was just a really good thing. And here's a little quote from her mom, from Gabby's mom. Quote, "My life's mission since she came into this world 21 years ago has been to make sure that she is remembered by everyone she meets, so that when the day comes that she's no longer on this earth, she has left an imprint on their souls." Close quote. I know. So now that we're both crying. So it was just a really good story.
That was a good one. That was a good ending.
Yeah, and go read the article or read about her story. I'm sure there's multiple out there. It's just like a really good story. So
what's her name again?
Gabby Horner Shepherd, I believe, was what it was. Yeah, Horner Shepherd. So yeah, thanks for listening, you guys.
Thank you guys for listening.
We're gonna try to stay on this regular Wednesday schedule. Get back onto that normal schedule.
We're getting back on track. I mean, we aren't fully unpacked or anything. Like, it's fine, but it's fine. It's fine.
It's fine. Totally fine. But yeah, thanks for listening, and check out our Instagram.
Yep, we're on Insta, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. Follow us on Twitter.
My Twitter's MarioTex30.
Yeah,
at
if you
Murdery
want to
Thingy.
read political articles
or good shit in the news, like with Gabby. So
or good shit in the news,
could
Mario's
be whatever. Gotta find some. Jesus Christ, in this day and age.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's I think probably gonna be it for this week. So